So, friends, if you have bad news that you need to break, and you want to break that bad news in the most compassionate, gentlest way possible, it's best to send an adult to do the job. Preferably a job who works in the helping professions. I'm thinking of nurses and social workers and chaplains and therapists, those kinds of people who, by virtue of their long years in this world, having dealt with a lot of different people, and having the experience, the on-the-ground experience of breaking bad news to people, they will be able to convey that bad news in the gentlest, most compassionate manner possible. I think that's safe to say. Alternatively, if you have bad news you need to break and you want to break that bad news in the most devastating way possible, it's best to send a teenager to do the job. By virtue of their hyper awareness of social dynamics and a not yet fully formed prefrontal cortex, which makes them more impulsive than adults and unable to appreciate the full weight and consequence of their words, they will, without batting an eye, be able to deliver that bad news in the absolutely most devastating way possible. Right, there is a good reason so many people hated their time in middle school and high school. It's because teenagers are uniquely equipped to detect weakness and personal insecurity and go after it like a shark after chum. If you work with teens, right, you know this is true. And clearly in today's reading from chapter 2 of the book of Jeremiah, and in the book of Jeremiah more generally, we see that at this point in Israel's history, God has opted for this second approach, this shock and awe approach, if you will. God has bad news to deliver to the people of Israel, and so he employs the 17-year-old Jeremiah to deliver that news in the most devastating way possible. So what is this bad news that God needs to break? It seems that Israel has been unfaithful and has turned to other gods, and that they either need to change their ways and change their ways fast, or foreign armies will be allowed to invade and destroy their country. Now, to most of us here gathered, I imagine that already seems devastating enough on its own. It's big, it's scary, it's serious. And even though that's the case, Jeremiah, bless his teenage heart, he manages to turn it up a few notches. This is what his teenage mind comes up with. He tells the people of Israel that they are like a she-camel in heat. He says they are like a female donkey during mating season. And by that, he means that foreign gods don't need to waste their energy looking for the Israelites because the Israelites are lustfully seeking them out. And what's more, he says, they have never met one that they've turned away. And maybe you noticed in your bulletin that we read only excerpts from chapter 2 this morning. And the reason for that is I didn't know if there would be young ears in the audience this morning, so I left out the really vulgar metaphors that Jeremiah uses. The parts we read today are Jeremiah on his best behavior. You can accuse him of many things, but you cannot accuse him of lacking imagination. I'll say that much. So here in chapter 2, Jeremiah, in his devastating teenage way, he lays out God's accusation against Israel in no uncertain terms. He tells the people that they've been unfaithful as unfaithful can be, and if they don't relent, they are headed for total disaster. But here it is important for us to keep something in mind. It's important for us to keep in mind that the Israelites were not good monotheists like you and I are good monotheists. They didn't believe that there was just one giant, ineffable, invisible God floating out there somewhere in the ether, a God that we give so many different names to. Rather, they are what we call theists, and that's your $5 word for this morning. They were henotheists. And what that means is that while they believed that they owed their worship and allegiance to the God of Israel, they in fact believed in the existence and the reality of a lot of different gods. So while of course they believed that their God Yahweh was real, they also believed that Baal, the god of the Canaanites, was real. They also believed that Molech, the god of the Ammonites, was real. They also believed that Tammuz, the god of the Sumerians, was just as real. So in other words, even though the Israelites believed in the existence and the reality of gods other than their own, and even though they were a people who by definition and to the very person were intimately familiar with the Ten Commandments, having been instructed and formed by them from an early age, the first commandment, of course, which says, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And even though that combination of facts should have made them uniquely on their guard, it should have had them actively policing themselves, actively searching themselves, making sure they weren't going astray and giving their worship and allegiance to a God other than the God of Israel, even though all of that is true, when Jeremiah comes on the scene in 626 BC, the worship of other gods and idols was so rampant that he aptly compares the Israelites to a bunch of horny donkeys. P.S. There's not a lot of churches that you're going to hear that phrase in this morning or ever. Aren't you glad you made the choice to worship with Hillside Community Church? But here's where I'm going with this. With all that the Israelites had going for them, they should have been uniquely resilient to the temptations of idolatry, and even so, they still fell prey to the worship of other gods. And if that is true, what chance do we stand? Good monotheists that we are, most of us don't believe in the existence of other gods, so we're not actively looking for other gods in our lives that we might be worshiping. And most of us in this room, I think even with a gun to our head, we probably couldn't recite the 10 Commandments. We certainly weren't instructed in them and formed by them in the same way that the Israelites were. Show of hands, before I mentioned it, who could have listed off that first commandment? I'm the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other God before me. A retired pastor's nodding his head, and a Catholic. Okay, with four people, okay. I'm just saying that's not great. That's not, our hearts aren't good. Which is all to say that compared to the Israelites, we are far more susceptible to the worship of other gods. And if they fell prey to it, then we really don't stand a chance. Because even in 21st century America, you need to know that every man, woman, and child bends their knee at one altar or another. Whether you are Christian, whether you are Buddhist, whether you are an atheist, everyone worships something. Everyone makes something the center of their lives. Among those who aren't religious, some center their lives on their work and career, some on their family and children, some on relationships and the approval of others, and some on this or that noble cause. And even among us wholesome, church-going, Jesus-loving folks, some of us think that we worship and center our lives on this God that we know as love, when we're really centering our lives on something else, when we are in fact worshiping a different God altogether. So a bunch of years back now, one of my colleagues was serving as a youth pastor at a church, and in that capacity he was running a teen youth group. And in that youth group there was a teenage girl, about 16 years old or so. She was feeling a little bit down, a little bit discouraged, a little bit depressed, and he was trying to offer her some encouragement, but he really wasn't getting anywhere with it. But in the course of their conversation together, there was this revelatory moment when she said this. She said, "Yeah, I know that God loves me, but what good is that when no boy at school will look at me?" Now, that may be a pretty typical teenage thing to say, but this girl's words are revealing, I think, of how all of our hearts work. To this girl, God's love was an abstract concept, while the attention of these boys, what was really real to her heart. And so she made that attention the measure of her life. Or to put it another way, she made the attention of these boys the God that she truly worshiped. And quite honestly, I think that is a great test for all of us to take. So I have a little homework assignment for you all. I want you to go home today after church, and in the privacy of your own thoughts, I want you to finish this sentence. What good is the love of God if? What good is the love of God if? If I can't afford the kind of car that I want, if my kids aren't turning out how I wanted, if my business isn't growing, if no one's swiping right on my profile, what is the good of God's love if? And if you can finish that sentence with ease, if something just flows off your tongue, then you know where your heart is really at. You know what God you are actually worshiping in your day-to-day life. And I offer you this test not in a judgy way. And sermon though this is, I'm not trying to be preachy, because this isn't a one-time, once-and-for-all question for us. If we learn anything at all from our study of the Old Testament, where on every other page the Israelites are worshiping this or that false god, if we learn anything from the Old Testament, we learn that this is a question that we need to ask ourselves on a consistent, on a regular, and on an ongoing basis. And in fact, that is the entire rationale for why we worship on a weekly basis and not on a quarterly or an annual basis. It's to keep calling ourselves back to the center of God's love. It's to keep reminding ourselves of who our God is supposed to be, to remind ourselves again and again that we're supposed to measure our lives by mercy and compassion and love. And sometimes, friends, we are called back to that center through a quiet prayer. Sometimes we are called back to it through a beautiful song, sometimes through a walk through nature, sometimes through a good turn done for us by a neighbor, sometimes through acts of service of our own. But sometimes, friends, just sometimes, it takes a foul-mouthed teenager to do the job. And so I pray for all of us that Jeremiah did his job this morning. Thanks be to God. Amen.